Now, Professor, there's been a lot of evidence in this inquiry in relation to the quality of the evidence that you would rely on for the fostering or for the promoting of the low carbohydrate, high fat diet. And when you look at the quality of evidence, Professor, as a scientist, would you be able to comment on the quality of evidence as it relates to different kinds of studies?
Thank you, Dr. Ramdas. I've discussed Semmelweis a few days ago, and I think a point I needed to make was that Semmelweis uses epidemiological evidence to conclude that there was something being taken from the autopsy rooms to the mothers by the doctors, and it was the transfer of what he called corpuscular particles that was causing the infections in the mothers during childbirth. He did not know that bacteria existed, and bacteria were really only discovered as a cause of ill health probably 10 or 15 years later by Pasteur. But all that he needed to do was to take a swab from a mother who was dying and to look at it under a microscope, and he would have seen the bacteria. But he didn't do that, and perhaps that's why he couldn't provide definitive evidence that he had worked out the cause of the disease. Along came Pasteur and was able to show that bacteria caused ill health. And the next great person was Robert Koch. And Koch is remembered for developing the 4 postulates for proving that a suspected agent causes specific disease. And the reason why Koch is remembered by medicine is, well, there are 2 reasons. Firstly, he was the first who was able to stain the tuberculous bacterium. So he had to develop a new way of staining it. So in other words, he could have taken infective material from people with tuberculosis. The first breakthrough was that he was able to stain the bacteria and ultimately to grow them as well. But he had a problem that he had to prove that the bacteria that he isolated from the people with tuberculosis was actually the cause of tuberculosis. And he went to the scientists in Germany and he said, listen guys, I've got a problem. I can now stain this bacterium, and I've got a patient who has tuberculosis. I want to prove to you that the bacteria I've isolated from this patient causes the disease. And they said to him, there are 4 criteria we want you to fulfill. And I'm going to give you those criteria. And they said, go away, and when you have all the evidence for those 4 criteria, you come back and you show it to us, and we will discuss whether you've got the definitive evidence for causation. And the rules were that the microorganism or other pathogen must be present in all cases of the disease. Secondly, the pathogen can be isolated from the diseased host and grown in pure culture, and he had to work out the way to grow the tuberculous bacterium. Then the pathogen from the pure culture must cause the disease when inoculated into healthy, susceptible laboratory animals. And finally, the pathogen must be re-isolated from the new host and shown to be the same as the original inoculated pathogen. And those are called the Koch's 4 principles. Now you can understand why that's easy if you're dealing with a bacterium, because those 4 relate exactly to bacteria, and you can reinfect a person and see whether they get the disease and so on, or reinfect an animal. Our problem in epidemiology is we're looking at multiple causes. We're not looking at one factor, and that's where it becomes so difficult to be certain that it's the one thing you're looking at. Is it the carbohydrates? Is it the fats? Is it the proteins? Is it whatever is causing the disease? Because there are multiple other things changing. So my point is, he had absolute proof. He could go to his death knowing that he had absolutely proved that tuberculosis is caused by the tuberculous bacterium. But we don't have the privilege of the absolute certainty. And I'm going to show you how we try to collect all different bits of information and put it together. And that's why it's taken so long to present all the evidence. Because I'm not Koch, and we're not dealing with one cause of this disease or these diseases. We're dealing with many potential causes. The story is really interesting. And the reason why it's interesting is that the last person to fulfill the Koch's principles were these 2 guys, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren. And they won the Nobel Prize in Australia in 2005. And the interesting point is that anyone in the world could have won that Nobel Prize. But what it required was two guys who didn't believe convention. That was the key. If they'd believed convention, they wouldn't have won the Nobel Prize. And so what happened was that Warren, the older doctor, was eccentric, and he had worked out a new way to stain for bacteria in the stomach, much like Koch had worked out how you stain for tuberculosis bacteria. And he had found in the stomachs of people with ulcers, when the stomach was removed as treatment for the ulcers, he would find many bacteria. But he was doing it all on his own, and no one believed him, and he was just left on his own. And then Marshall was a gastroenterologist who had to do his internship, and they said to him, you have to do a master's degree. Why don't you go and speak to Warren? He's mad. We don't believe what he's doing, but you might find it of some interest. So Marshall immediately realized this guy had something. It was unconventional. It was completely wrong. How could bacteria cause ulcers? We've known for 150 years that ulcers are caused by stress and too much acidity in the stomach. How could this man possibly be correct? So they then started to do the research, and ultimately they had worked out that they'd identified the bacterium that was causing the ulcers. The problem now was that to fulfill the Koch's principles, one of these two guys had to take the bacteria and give himself the disease, and then take the sample from the stomach and show that the bacteria were present and that the person was sick. So they had to use the Koch principles to prove, but they had to harm themselves. So Barry Marshall tells how his wife was very unhappy that he took this that took the bacteria. Anyway, took the bacteria, and then this is the story. The attempts to fulfill Koch's postulates for pyloric Campylobacteria. So he takes the bacteria, and then he shows that he becomes sick. He gets an ulcer. They put a tube down his stomach, and they take pictures of the ulcers, and then they scrape them, and they take out the bacteria. And then he takes antibiotics, and he's cured, and the bacteria are gone from the stomach, and the ulcers heal. So he was able to fulfill Koch's principles and prove that the disease was caused by bacteria. But it took him 10 years before it was accepted. And why not? Because the biggest selling drug in the world at that time was for the treatment of gastric ulcers. But the drugs didn't work because they just kept the symptoms at bay. And so he fought with industry for 10 years before he was acknowledged as a genius. He's exactly my age, so I'm very unhappy. Anyway, so here's the story of that Helicobacter. But so the point was, what I've taken you through is an example of how someone could prove definitively that a bacterium caused the disease. And this happened in my lifetime, that this man overturned convention. And he succeeded because he didn't listen to convention. He looked at the facts, and he said, these are the facts, and that's what they tell me. So when we teach students to look at evidence, these are the studies. That's how we classify studies. And I'm going to go through only the more important ones. Anecdotes, case series, which is a whole series of anecdotes, cross-sectional studies, case control studies, controlled laboratory studies, crossover study design, randomized control, prospective trials, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses. And I'm not going to go through all of them because they're not all relevant. I'm going to focus mainly on just a few anecdotes. Then we're going to look at randomized control prospective studies, and then we're going to look at meta-analyses. And we perhaps look at crossover study design as well. So we'll not go through all of them, but I'm going to take the evidence that we have today, and not any of it is going to be absolutely convincing that this is what is the truth. This is not a bacterium we're dealing with. We're dealing with a very, very complex group of conditions. So let's start with anecdotes. And anecdotes by themselves have no value. But when you have an anecdote, you might then move on and do another study, and ultimately a randomized controlled trial. And ultimately we might take a whole bunch of randomized controlled trials and analyze them as if they were a single study, and that's called a meta-analysis. So meta-analysis takes all individual studies which are of high quality and that conform to certain criteria, and then analyze them as if they're a single study, and then comes out with a conclusion. And the reason why the meta-analysis is helpful, because it's got such power, it's got so many studies that it includes. The problem with meta-analysis is you better make sure that the studies are good, because if they're not good, you're just going to make it worse. So let's look at anecdotes. And so anecdotes is where Twitter comes in and where social media comes in. And this is what is often driving the future of medicine are these anecdotes. Because these anecdotes gain power. They're very, very powerful, particularly if they conflict with what is conventional thinking. So I've just mentioned, here's Dr. Jay Wortman, who I think we've met before, but here's a man with type 2 diabetes. He's a first native Indian, Canadian, I should say, and he cures his type 2 diabetes, and that's quite important. It's quite important because, as I'll show, type 2 diabetes has never been shown to be reversed by conventional treatment. So here's a medical doctor who's involved in trying to improve the health of his people, who claims to have reversed his type 2 diabetes, and that's quite important. So what happened to me once I had started advocating the low carbohydrate diet? People started writing to me, and I showed you all those files, which we're not allowed to submit, but which you maybe have seen. And I started getting more and more letters, and I decided it was my responsibility to report these anecdotes because they were quite remarkable in many cases. And so I published that in the South African Medical Journal, to much dismay of many people, which was really interesting because I never claimed that I'd proved anything. And I listed it as an occasional survey, and at no point did I say this is definitive evidence. And so this is what it said. The study can analyze 127 communications from individuals self-reporting their weight change following adoption, etc. 16 reported the diet cured, in their words, medication no longer required, one or more of their medical condition, most commonly type 2 diabetes, 14 of those hypertension and high cholesterol. And I concluded these data show that significant rapid weight loss is possible on an unsupervised eating plan that severely restricts daily carbohydrate intake to approximately less than 75 grams. Better weight loss on this diet reported by these people, self-reported by these people, that was then on an isocaloric high carbohydrate low fat diet on a carbohydrate restricted eating plan than on isocaloric high carbohydrate low fat diet is well described in the literature. And then I mentioned probably due to paradoxical reduction of hunger by carbohydrate restriction. And why did I publish the paper? Because I wanted to draw attention to these anecdotes, because anecdotes can be powerful, but I also wanted to make the point that a randomized controlled clinical trial is urgently required in this country to disprove the hypothesis, not to prove, to disprove the hypothesis that the low carbohydrate, high fat eating plan can reverse cases of type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and hypertension without pharmacotherapy. And can I just add at this point that how powerful are anecdotes, that there is a blog page in South Africa run by Rita Fente in Cape Town, which has 160,000 people who are on this diet, who write to her and ask for information. So there's a community of 160,000 people in South Africa following this diet and interacting with each other.
Which diet is that, Professor?
That's the low carbohydrate, high fat diet, and reporting their benefits from it. And that you can't just ignore that evidence, it exists. So there were some anecdotes which were remarkable. And again, why do I make this point? Why do we discuss these anecdotes? Because they show what can happen, what is possible. And we're not trying to draw any conclusions. We're just saying that if we can't explain how this has happened, then we need to go and review our understanding. So this gentleman is from Cape Town. He's from Cape Town. And they both have type 2 diabetes and hypertension, and they look pretty heavy. And then there's a doctor who's become a great colleague of mine, friend, who has all those conditions, and he's tried everything that medicine has to offer. He consulted all the authorities in Cape Town. Nothing's worked because he's always hungry. As soon as he put on a particular diet, he's always hungry. And a year or two later, that's what they look like. And they've cured their type 2 diabetes, all three of them. And the doctor on the right is off his medication and so on. So now, are these important or not? Are they relevant? Well, to me they are, because they show what can be achieved if we understand what's going on. And this was the best example we've ever had. This man lost 83 kilograms in 28 weeks. Now, that probably is a world record. I've never heard of anyone who's lost more weight than that quickly. And the next slide is from the article. So this is the man's weight loss of 83 kilograms in 28 weeks, and it just shows what his average weight loss is on the top. It's between 3 to 6 kilograms a week. And he sustains it for 28 weeks, and then he stops, and his weight has been stable for 2 years. The weight stopped, the loss stopped completely. And when you ask him, say, Billy, what was the issue? He said, I had a sugar addiction, I had a carbohydrate addiction, and as soon as I got rid of those and followed your advice, I could solve the problem. But he understood. He said he's profoundly insulin or carbohydrate intolerant, and just increasing his carbohydrates the slightest bit causes the problems to recur. So what does he teach us? He teaches that it's possible to reverse morbid obesity without surgery dramatically in a short time if the person happens to have the individual that they will respond to the diet, but that they follow the advice. That's key. And he knows he may not eat more than 25 grams of carbohydrate a day. That's it. And he may not eat sugar. And as long as he does that, he's fine. And that's why there are 160,000 people who are interacting, because they're all finding that actually this thing does work for them dramatically. And then I'm going to show you a slide which is not science, got no science basis, but this is what, from all this information of talking to thousands of people and asking them what has happened to them, we come up with this slide which has got no science behind it. I don't claim it does, but this is what appears to be happening. And so as a scientist, when I watch the anecdote, I say, fine, my responsibility is to explain, why does this happen? Why does this appear to be happening? And what we find is that if we take people, this is what we think happens. If you are mildly insulin resistant, i.e. you're pretty carbohydrate tolerant, really it doesn't matter how much carbohydrate you eat, or the 400 grams or 50 grams, your weight's pretty stable. But as you become increasingly insulin resistant, the same amount of carbohydrate causes you to increase your weight. And what it seems to tell us is that if you are morbidly insulin resistant, like those two people I showed you, like Billy Tosh, if he's put on a diet in which he's told to reduce his calories, and you can still have a bit of sugar here, and you can have a bit of this, you can moderate that, and just healthy eating and so on, you may reduce their carbohydrate intake a little bit because you've cut their calories, but it goes from 350 to 250. And as far as the outcome for him is, nothing changes. Because we have to understand that there's something special in these people that only when you get their carbohydrate intake to so low, in other words, you give them a profoundly restrictive carbohydrate diet, which is full of nutrients but is carbohydrate poor, then they show these remarkable effects. And the reason why people regress on this diet and why we can't show that the diet is better than other diets is because people regress to the mean. And so I know with Billy that if he increases his carbohydrate intake to 100 grams a day, which is nothing, there are very few people in this audience eating as little as 100 grams, he will immediately become obese again. And we don't know the mechanism, but that's the observation. So as a scientist, my job is to report this and say, guys, let's go and find out what's going on here. And that's what we did. That's why we put in our NRF grant. We asked for money to study insulin resistance in people who are doing lots of exercise and are still fat, and saying, what's the mechanism of all this? Because that's our responsibility. It's not to say Billy Tosh doesn't exist. He can't exist. It's impossible. Our responsibility is to say Billy Tosh tells us something, and we've got to find out. Because if he can reverse his morbid obesity without any scientific input whatsoever, other than reading what I said on the internet, that's all he did. He just read what I said on the internet and followed the guidelines. And he reversed his morbid obesity. Now, if we can reverse his morbid obesity, what's a guy who's 10 kilograms overweight, is a little hypertensive? I mean, that should be easy to do.
Professor, when you say he followed the guidelines, which guidelines are you referring to?
He followed my guidelines in the Real Meal Revolution. So the question is, when does an anecdote become a black swan? Now, the story of the black swan is that the British, who knew everything, said that swans are always white. And unfortunately, someone went to Australia and noticed there were a few black swans. So he reported back to the British, to the English, and said, we've got a problem. We've got black swans here. And so he was told, because the British know everything, they said, no, it's not, that's not a swan. So they did all the studies, and then they decided it was a swan. And so then they had to realize that swans can be black. And when you see a black swan, everything you believed before about the swan, all the definitions of what it is, have to be changed. And so if you see a patient with diabetes who reverses diabetes, they become a black swan, not an anecdote. So, and this is one of the great writers in the low-carb movement, Richard Feynman. So the question you always ask, how many subjects do you require in a trial to prove an effect? And the answer to that is it depends on how many people recover spontaneously. So if every day in Cape Town someone is spontaneously reversing their type 1 or type 2 diabetes, then we need to study a lot of people to show that the effect is real that we claim, because there's going to be a background of people who are reversing their disease anyway. But in medicine, it's never been a single reported reversal of type 2 diabetes in patients following conventional medical advice. And therefore, it becomes very important. If you see a single case, it becomes a black swan, and it tells us something that's important. So there, the black swans appear. So I argue that we are seeing a lot of black swans on the internet. A lot of people every day are tweeting, not a lot, but people are tweeting frequently that they have reversed type 2 diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, etc. by following this diet. That is the low carbohydrate, high fat diet. And my argument is, as a scientist, it's my responsibility to look at that and see, is it possible? And that is why the Noakes Foundation has raised 1.7 million rand overseas to do the first study in South Africa to see, can we reverse type 2 diabetes by following this diet? That's my responsibility as a scientist, to go out and help scientists get the money so that they can do the research. So here is an anecdote. I got all this information. People wrote to me. I must turn it into science, into hard science. And that's my job. So the presence of a black swan requires the immediate funding of a proper scientific study, a randomized controlled clinical trial to test whether it's possible to reverse type 2 diabetes with a low carbohydrate diet. And I'm committed to that, and the study has in fact started. We're employing the right people to do the study. We started the employment in January the 1st this year. And we have people doing PhDs on this research right at the very moment. And that's my responsibility as a scientist. So that's where anecdotes fit in. And occasionally anecdotes can give you all the evidence you need, but usually we need to go and do hard science. So we're going to move on to randomized controlled prospective clinical trials. And these are considered the gold standard because you take a population and you test your hypothesis that there's one thing you're going to change, and that is going to produce an outcome. So you change the population, and then you see whether that one variable change produces a different outcome. And you may have to work 2 years or 8 years or 10 years or 24 years or whatever. Let me tell you that there can never be a completely proper randomized controlled prospective clinical trial of nutrition. It is impossible. Why? Because to set up that trial, you would need about 50,000 people. You would have to lock them up in a jail for the next 40 years. And you would control exactly everything they do. And the only difference between the two groups, you randomize them to two groups. The only difference is the one group eats a particular diet and the other group eats other diet. They must maintain the same smoking rates. They must do the same amount of exercise. They're not allowed to get divorced because that's going to influence the outcome. And so on. So you have to control their lives absolutely, completely. And it's not possible. So people who suggest that we have the final answer to diet because we've done this randomized trial or that randomized trial and it showed this, unfortunately, it's never going to be perfect. So that's the point. And I again emphasize that if I'm challenged that there are no data for low carbohydrate diets over 40 years, the same applies to every other diet. There is no diet that can be studied. There are some good studies which we'll talk about where they try to control everything, but they can't. It's impossible. So, and one of the reasons why nutrition got into trouble was because they realized that these trials are impossible. And they're very expensive. Imagine locking 50,000 people away for 40 years, what it's going to cost. So they said, well, what we'll do instead is we'll upgrade bad science and make it sound like it's good science. And that's an argument I'm going to make. So the bad science was we take people and we find out what they were eating 40 years ago, or we follow them for 40 years. So we do an analysis and we find these people eating lots of bacon and these people eating lots of processed foods, and we follow them for 40 years and see what they die from. And then we draw conclusions that it was their nutrition that caused them to die. It wasn't the fact that they did other things, or we tried to control for those variables, but we're focusing on nutrition. And the problem is that's an associational study. And you can never know that the people who are doing X were also not doing Y, and it was Y that prevented their not getting disease. Or, for example, people who are healthy, maybe eating cereals, may not eat sugar. It might be what they're not doing that explains their health. But in a randomized controlled prospective trial, you're never going to find out what they aren't doing, which might be healthy. And that's the problem. So what happened in the 1960s was people said randomized controlled trials are too expensive. We're going to say that if we do prospective studies, if we do these observational studies, that's good enough. And I will show you how they've reduced the quality of the observational studies to the point where you can prove almost anything with an observational study. So, one of the definitive studies of the low-fat diet was done in the United States. It's called the Low-Fat Dietary Pattern and Risk of Cardiovascular Disease, the Women's Health Initiative Randomized Controlled Dietary Modification Trial. This was a very expensive study, and it was set up, in my opinion, to prove that the low-fat diet improves the health of these women. There were 48,000 postmenopausal women who were going to be studied for 8 years. They were divided into two groups, as shown on the next slide. So 48,000 postmenopausal women were divided into two groups. 40% were assigned to the low-fat eating pattern, and 60% they could just eat what they liked. And the group that was put on the eating plan were told to reduce their energy from fat to 20% and from saturated fat to 7%, and increase the fruit and vegetable intake to at least 5 servings per day and grains to at least 6 servings per day. So that would be the balanced, healthy diet that we prescribe. The other group were told to just read the dietary guidelines for Americans, and they were given other health-related material, but they had no contact with nutritional interventionists. Whereas the group who got the intervention met a few times a year, I think it was like monthly, and there they discussed with the people running the research what they should be eating and so on, and they got feedback. So that tells you that the trial was not in fact fair, because the group who got the dietary advice also received other information. And the problem for the study would be that if it actually found a positive outcome, you don't know whether it's the diet or the intervention with the people that made the difference. So that they would have talked at they might have been told to stop smoking, they might have got all sorts of other advice, they're told to run marathons, who knows. So that was the problem, that study. And the subjects were followed for 8.1 years. So this is a fantastic study. I mean, can you imagine the effort that went into this study and the money? I know the total study cost $700 million, but there were side parts of the study that were included were very helpful. So it's an amazing study. It's honestly designed by the National Institute of Health to answer the question for once and for all, and that's their responsibility, and they took it seriously, and they invested $700 million into it. And so, amazing. And what did they find? After 8 years, this amazing study said the study did not significantly reduce the risk of coronary heart disease, stroke, or cardiovascular disease in postmenopausal women, and achieved only modest effects on cardiovascular risk factors. So after all that effort, that was the outcome. And, it must have been devastating for the scientists who did it. But this is not the only very expensive low-fat randomized controlled trial with this finding. There are two others, the Mr. Fit trial and the Look Ahead trial in diabetes, and they all came to the same conclusion. So we have to conclude that the best scientists in the world looked at this problem. They put all their effort into it, and they still couldn't find an effect. Now, what we should therefore say is that the best studies we've done have not been able to support the idea that the low-fat diet is healthy and improves health. That's what we should conclude. But we tend not to be told that. These studies tend to be hidden and forgotten and not spoken about as they should be. But there were parts of the study which were a bit worrying. And this was a study on looking at insulin resistance in this study. So this is women who, again, were on the diet. Now, we weren't looking at heart disease outcomes, we're looking at diabetes outcomes and insulin resistance. And what they found was the following. So this is for women who were sick at the start of the trial. Remember, understand that they had diabetes. Now, therefore, this healthy diet should make them even healthier. But it didn't. Women with diabetes at baseline did experience adverse glycemic effects of the low-fat diet. And that's predictable, because if you increase your carbohydrate intake, which you have to do if you're on a low-fat diet, that would happen. So it indicated that caution. So they found that they experienced adverse glycemic effects in the first year of the study. So caution should be exercised in recommending a reduction in overall dietary fat in women with diabetes, and then unless accompanied by additional recommendations to guide carbohydrate intake. Now, that's circumlocution. I mean, it's astonishing that the scientists spend all this money and then they don't have the courage to say what they have to say. Because what they have to say, unless accompanied by additional recommendations to reduce carbohydrate intake. Because it was the increase in the carbohydrate intake because you load the fat that caused the problem. So you must admit it and say, come on, let's move on. And what I found interesting is they've never reported the 8-year data on the women with diabetes in that study. And the question would be, why not? So, nonsense. Sorry? Oh, it looks like I added something, so we'll have to remove that. So my point would be then, I added that afterwards. So my point would be that this study, which is of a low-fat diet, showed that women with diabetes did worse on the diet. And therefore the advice should be that, in fact, the low-fat diet is contraindicated for women with diabetes. And I've given you all the evidence why that should be. So there's a long-term randomized control trial suggesting low-fat diet didn't do much for anyone, but in fact for diabetics it made them worse. And that perhaps should have acknowledged that. So now how did Harvard Medical School interpret this? Because the study included people from Harvard, and this was their release in 2007 or 2008. They said the low-fat, this is 2008, remember we're now in 2016, we're 8 years later, 8 years after the publication of this study. And this is what Harvard said: the low-fat diet is not a cure-all. Results from the large, long Women's Health Initiative study shows no effect on heart disease, breast cancer, colorectal cancer, or weight. A low-fat, high-starch diet that was the focus of dietary advice during the 1990s, as reflected by the US Dietary Guidelines Food Guide Pyramid, is dying out. Okay, it's taken a long time to die out because 8 years later, it's still not dead. So a growing body of evidence has been pointing to its inadequacy for weight loss or prevention of heart disease and several cancers. The final nail in the coffin comes from this study, etc. And I must so although the media have made much of the disappointing results, then they says, oh, but you can still eat you still mustn't eat fat. So even though they're trying to say low fat, there's no evidence that low fat's healthy, they still can't take the jump that maybe we should be reducing the carbohydrate rather. So, but my point is, please, that here's a study that disproved convention, but convention survives, and it remains very powerful 6 years or 7 years later. And you have to ask, why? Why can't people be honest and say the study failed to support the hypothesis? There we should reject the hypothesis. And that's called the null hypothesis. So when these authors set up the Women's Health Initiative, they should have said, if the study doesn't find an outcome, it disproves the hypothesis. But they didn't. And a lot of the arguments about why the study failed was the methodological problems in it. But please, that was the best study we could do. It cost $700 million. If there were methodological problems, then that's it. We still have to accept the outcome and not now try to justify, actually didn't really find that. So the low-fat, high-starch diet is dying out. A growing body of evidence has been pointed to its inadequacy for weight loss or prevention of heart disease and several cancers. And a final nail in the coffin comes from that study. So that's the important one, the important conclusion from that.